And so, to get started, today is Tuesday, September 5th, 2023. My name is Ebony Love, and I am located in Riviera Beach, Florida. This conversation is taking place over Zoom, and I am joined by Professor Jonathan Barry Blocker. Professor Barry Blocker, can you start by introducing yourself and tell us where you are physically located?
Sure. My name is Jonathan. I am currently located in Raleigh, North Carolina, in my home, in my kitchen.
Okay, and so I know that you're not from Raleigh, North Carolina. So can you kind of tell me where you grew up?
Sure. I'm a Florida native, so born and raised in Orlando, Florida. My parents hail from either end of the state. My mom from Pensacola and my dad from Miami. So they raised their family smack dab in the middle of the state. I enjoyed my childhood. It was wonderful.
So, being from Central Florida, I kind of did a little bit of research on you. And I found out that CNN had done an interview with you about being a descendant from Rosewood. So, can you kind of tell me what Rosewood is and what it means to you and your family?
Yes. Rosewood is a massacre that occurred in the early part of the 20th century in north central Florida, about 15 minutes east of Cedar Key and about 40 minutes west of Gainesville, Florida. It was a small, for its time, prosperous Black community that was dependent on a turpentine camp and sawmill, I believe. um, and so from what I've done some preliminary research for my family history, my father's ancestors moved from South Carolina and Georgia and settled in Rosewood, and that's where my great grandparents met. And they had my grandfather and his siblings, and the massacre occurred when a white woman alleged that a mysterious black man, attacked and assaulted her. When history and some eyewitness or victim accounts indicate that she had had an affair with a white man, and stuff went down. But she put it on a mysterious black man. And so that led, as often happened in that era and following the Civil War, if a white woman's sexuality or body was alleged to have been threatened or harmed by a dark-skinned person, white male America went on the rampage to vindicate the alleged injuries. And so a mob of white men from, I think, a tri-county area, if not farther, descended on Rosewood and ended up destroying the town. They killed several people. There's never been a firm death count, but there are some confirmed deaths, and everyone scattered. So, in the case of my family, ultimately, my great grandparents split up, with my great grandmother taking all her children on a train south and ending up in Polk County, Florida, and then finally settling in South Florida in the Miami area. And my great grandfather stayed. He had a business on the side, as far as I can tell, and they never reconnected. And he ended up resettling, I think, in Tampa and starting another family. So the massacre literally split up my family. Um, but my grandfather and his siblings survived. However, because of Rosewood, they they all became entrepreneurs and did not trust uh, the established economic systems and way of life for Black people as far as working for white people, white companies. They all chose to somehow self-generate or make sure that they were never dependent on other people again. But to further answer your question, I did not learn of Rosewood until the movie came out. I think that was 1999, because my grandfather never talked about it, and he never shared it with us until he was forced to by my dad. And even then, I don't remember the encounter, but my dad tells me it lasted 5 minutes. He just sat there, basically said the same facts my dad had already told us, and that was it. Um, yeah. And so I never knew really in depth of my connection or anything until I was, let me think, in college. I saw the movie, And that so enraged me that I did not leave my dorm all weekend because I didn't know how I would feel about white people I encountered. Because I just thought this travesty was so ridiculous. Why did no one protect or avenge Black victims? I understood why, right? But emotionally, I was upset with humanity. And then when the Black Lives Matter uh, uprisings started during the pandemic, I had time. I wasn't having to go to the office, and it just felt like it was touching a little too close to my family history. And so I started digging and looking up information, and I found information on my grandfather and his family in a repository of Old Dominion University. And the archivists were kind enough to digitally scan the documents I requested and sent it to me. And that led me on further searches. So it's been a journey, right? It's one leg of my family. There's tragedy entwined with it. There's been silence for over half a century. My grandfather passed while I was in law school in the early aughts, so we never talked about it again, right? Beyond whatever my dad said happened when I was a kid, a teenager. But yeah, that has been the impact on Rosewood. And so now, as a descendant, I want to know more. I have visited the home of the white store owner who hid some of the Black victims from the mob. I got to go inside the home. I took pictures. I took my girls. They don't understand. They're too young, right? But my eldest, she's like, "Why are we here? Why are we in the forest?" And I said, "Well, our family used to live here, and someone told a big lie, and that lie made people upset, and then they hurt other people, and some of those people that they hurt were our family, and so we fled, and our life is what it is now, but it's important that they know."
And that's really interesting how you kind of bring that up because one of the things that I've been focusing on is this idea of passing oral traditions because way back when, as well as during and after the Civil War, formerly enslaved individuals could only share their stories by telling it. And so they would tell it to journalists who wanted to listen. But it's interesting hearing your family story because your grandfather did not want to tell his story because of the trauma that, yeah, your grandfather, because of the trauma that comes with it. And so, do you have any reflections on our generations trying to bring out these stories and why some people might consider it as rewriting history when in reality the history was never recorded because of our silence?
Yes, and that's a difficult question, Miss Love, because I recognize that silence is a form of protection, right, to cauterize wounds, and I also understand it's a form of protection so that there's no further harm. So I definitely advocate people either writing down their family history, recording it. I really love this project, and something I've wanted to do for years, and I've never pulled the trigger on, is literally interviewing my parents and my grandparents, but I've lost both my grandparents within the past 5 years. But my wife did ask questions of my grandma when no one was looking. And so every year on my grandmother's birthday, she sends out a clip of conversations she had with my grandmother and shares it with all of us. And it's amazing. It's amazing to hear her voice. Um, some of this, the things she shared. And so I would encourage folks, no matter your age, no matter what, if you think you're a professional or not, sit down and ask some questions. Even if you just do free word association, even if it's tell me about the music of your life at each epoch. I don't care. Just get it down. There's so much we don't know, so much. And it wasn't until my grandfather had dementia that he thought I was one of his cousins. And so he would share things that he never shared when he was in his right mind. And then I think my grandmother, as she got older and I became more mature, she would share things. And I never recorded those conversations, right? I remember to the best I can, but I encourage everyone to do that. At the same time, I would encourage people to think on why maybe there's silence. So what I learned, we had the centennial for the Rosewood survivors or descendants and survivors in January of this year. And I learned from one of the survivors, Mr. Gregory Doctor, his uncle, Arnett Doctor, was the one who pushed for the reparations bill and everything about 20 plus years ago. But Mr. Gregory Doctor told us how um, his grandmother at Christmas time, she would never speak. She would get very despondent. And so all the adults would gather in the house and they'd send the children outside to play. He said this was for years. He never understood why, right? He knew Rosewood had happened, but he never understood. And their family at least talked about that it happened, but he never understood why she got silent. It was just shrouded in mystery. And come to find out, after the massacre, the company that had the sawmill near the town had another sawmill in another part of the state, and they invited the black survivors to come and work the other sawmill. So they did. But then, when the sawmill outside of Rosewood eventually closed down, the white workers relocated to the remaining mill alongside the black survivors. So the black survivors were living next door and amongst some of the perpetrators. And so when he said he finally understood his grandmother's annual anguish and depression when the movie came out, and there was a guy who used to go door to door selling fish in their community, a white guy, and the white guy stopped showing up. And so people started asking questions and come to find out the white guy was the son of the woman who started everything. And so someone had told him his life would probably be in danger once enough Black people saw the movie. And so he left the community, never to be seen again. And so there is a power in silence, there is preservation in silence. But in spite of that, I think there is a definite need to record and transmit. And whether or not parents or you decide to wait until someone is 20 or 32, or you've relocated geographically to another area, I think it's important people understand where they come from, what has transpired, because the things that happen to us for good or bad imprint on our body, our DNA, and it can explain some things, why certain behaviors happen in your family, why people talk this way, why, like there's been studies, it's called epigenetics, why descendants of the Holocaust sometimes have greater expressions of like it's not hypertension, this depression, it's a couple other health issues, but it's reoccurring and it's to the point that they've pointed it to the Holocaust impacted the DNA of the survivors and how it expresses. And so that has been transmuted to their descendants. So you should know, you should ask questions, you should find out. And in the case of Rosewood descendants, knowing allows you to qualify for the reparations of free or college tuition to a Florida state school, right? And my family, because we didn't know. So all of us went out of state. But if we had known, would that have impacted our decisions to stay in state for school? And so I'm tracking it now and making sure my girls understand it. So no matter what happens in my life, when they come of age, they have the option of staying in Florida and using their reparations to fund their education.
And so that kind of brings me to my next question. You said that you saw the Rosewood movie when you were in college and you went to Morehouse. Can you kind of explain how you decided to go to that school and what influenced you to go to Atlanta?
Yeah. So growing up, I was in gifted. I was tested positive for gifted like third grade. And for those who don't know, gifted is a program where allegedly they find all the super bright or high aptitude, academic aptitude children, and they set them aside for special instruction or special classes or whatever. But I was always the only black male, and I was like, I know there are other smart black children. And so growing up, I was always the only black male in my gifted classes. There might be one or two black women. And at one time, there was another black male, Darnell. He was bussed in from another black school, and then he disappeared, and I never saw him again. I was back to being alone. And so I spent most of elementary, middle, and then in high school, I did the international baccalaureate program, IB. I was always like the black male. And so that's just a lonely place to be, right? Because back in the 90s and early aughts, black masculinity identity was tied to black entertainment television or BET, or what was depicted on there, rapping, gold chains, flashy teeth, baggy clothes. And I was like a Theo Huxtable from the Cosbys. Dressed well. My parents were solid middle class. My mother had a jar where you couldn't say ain't or get, where you would lose money. You had to pay money into the jar. So I spoke very proper. In fact, classmates sometimes asked if I was British. And I was like, no, I'm from Florida. But that was my existence, right? And so I was lonely on a cultural level. I did have black friends, right? But again, I spent most of my day separated from them because of my academic courses. And so Morehouse and Howard, FAMU, they were on my radar. My parents believe in college education. So growing up, we would visit colleges. I mean, since little kids, we had college pennants. I remember Princeton, Harvard, Rutgers, everything was on my ceiling, a pennant for every college we visited. And by the time I was in high school, I was like, I just want to go to a black school. And so I knew I wanted to go to a well-regarded Black school. And I also knew I wanted to be around a space where there were a significant number of other smart Black men. I was tired of being feeling like the only one and sifting through that. So I identified Morehouse and Howard as my top choices. I liked Hampton also, but Morehouse and Howard. Morehouse offered me the best financial aid package. It was Atlanta. I had family there, and so I went. And it was a very informative experience. I'll put it like that. But I felt fulfilled. Even my guidance counselor said, "Why don't you go to Emory? Yeah, I can get you this full ride at Emory University in Atlanta." And Emory's a great school, beautiful campus. I have friends from there. But as I told him when I was a junior, I was tired of being the only one, and I wanted to be with other smart Black people. And I found those people there at Morehouse and definitely at Spelman and Clark Atlanta. And for the time that Morris Brown College or Morris Brown University was open, or was it a college?
It's reopened. It reopened.
Open. I'm so happy for it. But for the time, my first year, all four of the big schools at the AUC were open, and I that experience was invaluable. And so when I left Morehouse, I had no more questions about being a smart Black man. I knew there were people smarter than me, more talented than me. I knew people that were comparable to me, and so I was able to re-enter a white-dominated world and feel okay about where I figured as a Black person in that world. So when I came to UF Law, I was very confident. I may have not been the best student, but I understood I had the chops and I had the acumen, and it was all coming down to whether or not I had the skill set they wanted at that time. But as far as raw intellect and ability, I wasn't significantly worse than my white classmates. I was on par with many. So that's why I chose Morehouse. It did what it needed to do for me. Not everyone needs to go to a Black college. Um, like my parents grew up in Black neighborhoods during segregation, so they were like, "Okay, we've seen Black people. We know the gamut." I was like, "That's great for you, but you chose to raise me in a white neighborhood," and so I chose to go to HBCU. My siblings did not choose that option; they chose to go elsewhere. But I'm happy with my decision. It did what it needed to do for me.
I identify with the story you just told because, like you, I was bused to my school. You talked about the one black male classmate that you had that was bused into your school and then he disappeared. In a sad story, not this past Saturday, but the Saturday before, there was a gunman who came to Jacksonville and decided to carry out a hate crime. And unfortunately, the streets that that crime happened in are the same streets that I was bussed through. And
Hmm.
so, my next question for you is, why did you choose to go to law school? You explained earlier you saw Rosewood, and that kind of, you said actually, you were emotionally upset with humanity. And so, how did you go from watching Rosewood, having that experience going through Morehouse, and getting that thing you didn't know that you were missing by not being around people who looked like you, and going into law school and becoming an attorney?
Um, that's a very interesting. It's a very interesting answer. So for most of my childhood, I wanted to be a marine biologist. I love the ocean. I love sea creatures, all that stuff. And in fact, when I went to law school, I thought I was going to be an environmental lawyer. However, I learned over time that marine biologists don't have the lifestyle I wanted, right? You're dependent on grants. It looked like a little bit of hard living. And so I thought, this ain't it. And then I thought I might be a doctor because everybody in my magnet program wanted to be a doctor. And then I took higher level bio and I was like, no, this ain't it either. But my grandmother, Mary Louise Postel, always said, you have the gift of talk. So you're either going to be a preacher or a lawyer. I used to say, my dear, I'm not doing either. I'm a marine biologist. I'm gonna be a whatever. And she's like, nope, preacher or lawyer. And so while I love Jesus, I don't believe I should at this point in my life be spiritually guiding anybody. I'll be your trustee. So I was like, maybe it'd be law. And while I was at Morehouse, I was a psych major. I was going to be a school psychologist like my dad. But again, they would see at the time there was a cap on the general track of school psychologists, what they were going to make. And I was like, that ain't for me. And so I remember what my grandmother said, and on a whim, I started studying for the LSAT, took it. Um, and I went with law school. And so that's literally how I ended up in law school. I dabbled, like I interned for a law firm in college one summer, but I was like, yeah, maybe. I had no real idea when I entered law school what it is lawyers do, what the options were for lawyers. I knew of lawyers back home in my home community, but I didn't feel close to any of them, emotionally close. So I didn't really look to any of them as mentors, right? Even though some looking back may have been willing to be a mentor, I did not feel that I was reliable enough with my interest in the law. So I stumbled into law and actually it ended up being great for me. Intellectually, I always like to be, I'm very curious, and the law allows a profession where you can just scope out new problems and resolve issues and explore things to your heart's content. Um, and so that's how I did it, right? My goal was when I first got in law school, though, was to be an intellectual property attorney. When I came of age in college, there was this, I don't know how to call it, but there was there was a hip hop era. Hip hop had finally gone mainstream. People were making buku bucks, but there was also this explosion in the Black experience, specifically with collegiate stepping. And so I used to watch Nickelodeon and see these children doing steps, or what was it? What was that movie that came out? Stomp the Yard came out with the marching bands. I was like, that's Black culture. And I always used to think, are we getting these coins? Right? I could look at someone performing on Nickelodeon doing a step, and I'd be like, oh, that looks AKA-ish, that looks Q-ish. And as I got to law school, I recognized that that was kind of synonymous with trademarks, right? I see something in the marketplace that is signifying its origins, but I kept thinking, are my people getting coins? And so my goal when I entered law school was to be an intellectual property attorney uh, for the outcome of helping Black people protect their creative output and properly monetize it. Because too many of our entertainers and creatives from the early to mid 20th century died broke. So many died broke. I mean, so many fabulously talented people died broke, or it was stolen from them, right? Either they spent it too much of it or it was stolen from them. And so I wanted to stop that. And that was my goal for entering law school back in 2006. But again, it was happenstance. I wasn't like goal oriented on law. I just remember what my grandma said and I went with it.
Are you a member of a fraternity?
I'm sorry?
Are you a member of a fraternity?
I am not. I am, as my dad would say, me fi me.
I only ask because, like, a lot of people, because you went to an HBCU, you know the culture and everything. And so it's interesting when I have these conversations to see where the knowledge comes from. I had another conversation with somebody a couple of days ago who went to an HBCU and she was talking about what the yard is. And I was like, can you explain that for the people who might not know what a yard is, especially for our high school students and things like that?
Yeah, it was amazing. But it's fair that you asked. My mother is an AKA, and she chartered a chapter at UF, and she chartered a grad chapter in Orlando. So I grew up surrounded by a lot of AKAs. One of my best friends I mean, he's basically a brother. His mother was my mom's sorority sister in college. My mom helped pledge her. And so I grew up hearing stories from my mother's perspective of what AKA did for her. I got my dad's perspective of like, whatever. He's kind of a loner. But I grew up surrounded by that, right? So I had a perspective on what Greek life was supposed to be and what it's supposed to do for you, or at least what I saw it do for my mom and her some of her sorority sisters and friends in Central Florida. And so the game had changed by the time I got to Morehouse. I was like, this ain't quite the energy or the way it was set up for me after dinner conversations. My mother would regale us with stories. Um, but I appreciate what those organizations do, and I appreciate that for those who are not at Black colleges and universities, they provide an incubator, a cultural incubator. And for those that are at Black colleges and universities, they're just on another level culturally. Sometimes they do too much, but they add exquisite detail to what it is to be Black in America. Um, and I think it's a beautiful thing to see, and it's a beautiful option for people to have.
And so I don't think we ever really talked about your parents, but you just said that your mom went to UF, I believe.
Yes.
And so can you tell me a little bit about your parents and their educational background?
Sure, my parents grew up in single parent households, went to college. My mom started out at HBCU, Dillard University in Louisiana, and then she transferred to UF during the early integration years. And my dad went to UF coming out of Miami, the hood in Miami, over the lowered expectations of a guidance counselor. Someone tried to steer him to FAMU or BCC and say that was all he was good for, but that was the only place he'd get into. And he was like, F that, I'm gonna go to UF. And he got into UF and he went to UF. So my parents met at UF. My mother was the outgoing one on campus, activities, leadership. I'm sure if Blue Key had been more open to Black people back then, she'd probably be Blue Key. And my dad was just about the books, and maybe holding little rent parties at his apartment, and trying to scheme and get a date. So my parents met there. They've been together ever since. Um, and so yeah, that's how they met. My dad ended up getting his master's and almost finished his PhD at UF. He would drive back on weekends. I've learned since we were born, he pursued his PhD after we were born. And so he would drive back a couple weekends and hole up in a motel and study and do classwork. And this was back in the 80s. He never got his dissertation finished. So, but yeah, my parents, all their degrees are from UF, and they matriculated in the 70s. And in fact, during my parents were there when there was the Black Thursday protests by all the Black students and the few Black faculty asking for change from President O'Connell. So they were there for some tumultuous times.
For anyone who is listening to this recording, there are plenty of oral histories on Black Thursday, including one from yours truly on the Black and Brown Wednesday that happened in 2017. But it was like a resurgence of Black Thursday. But that's a whole other story for another day. But can you tell me about your hyphenated last name, Barry Blocker? Where does that come from?
Sure. So my parents' last name is Blocker. My wife's last name growing up was Berry. But when we married, um, she did. My wife is part West African, and so the Berry is from her father, who is West African, and she did not want that erased, right? As we all understand, being Black in America, there's sometimes if you've been here, if your family's been here for over a century, it's hard to trace your roots, to know who you came from, what you came from, what influenced your bloodlines. And so she didn't want that erasure, and she wanted to make sure it was always remembered. And she also didn't want to be subsumed within the patrilineal system of naming that we use here in America. And so we talked, and I was like, sure, I'm down for a hyphenation. I was like, Blocker should go first though, because Barry's is an otherwise masculine name, and people might think I'm being pretentious in saying my full government name with, if it's Jonathan Barry Blocker. She's like, no, I'm a woman. I go first. And I was like, fine. She's like, and you're being ridiculous. We hyphenated our names. We announced it. We surprised everyone at the wedding when we said I do. Our friend Julie, who was officiating, she announced us as Mr. and Mrs. Barry Blocker. And there was gasp and, some pearl clutching from the old folk. But it's been great. But I was right. When we got to Alabama, people like to give their full name first, middle, and last. And people kept thinking Barry was my middle name. And so sometimes they call me Barry. I was like, no, it's Barry Blocker. There's a hyphenation in there. So I sometimes had to say my name fast or give artful pauses, but whatever. So yes, we're Barry Blocker. Our girls are Barry Blocker. People joke, especially my father-in-law, that the girls will never be able to fit their whole name on any government records because they have hyphenated last names and two middle names. So it's a lot of names going on, but that's how we chose it. We briefly toyed with merging and creating a new last name, but we couldn't find any combinations we liked or any new names we wanted to go with. So we just hyphenated. And so that's the other reason for that. So besides the feminist angle and my wife's concern with erasure, this also goes back to the lack of genealogy, of concrete genealogy. And I want my descendants, however it works out for them, to be able to understand some signals that I'm sending them. So with Barry and Blocker, I want them to know, okay, there's a Barry that you should be hunting for as you do your record keeping, and there's a Blocker. I want them to understand and discover that Barry is a common name in the part of West Africa my father-in-law hails from. It's as common as we have Smith or Johnson over here. And so I want them to understand that it's not per se from colonialism. There's some indications that it predates the French contact with that country. And then I also have named my girls a certain way so that linguistically I am signaling to my descendants ethno-linguistically who we're descended from, right? And what are the contributions. And so the girls' names are from multiple languages, but each language is something I believe we have a genetic or ancestral claim to. And so that is another reason for the hyphenated name. I want it to be a map for my descendants.
The reason why I love this so much is because I started trying to go through my own family history and I found out that my grandma is adopted. And so I don't know what her original last name was, right? And so it's like her adopted family. After her adoptive father went off to serve in World War II, he came back and had to go onto a sharecropper farm. And like, it's a mess. I'm like, I don't know if that's where he hails from or if that's just the farm that he ended up on after the war, and it's a mess. But I love that you're doing that for your family so that they can have that kind of lineage, because it's very hard for people who are descended from enslaved people to go back and track things. And it gets even worse with adoptions and forced family separations, like what you talked about with your family history in Rosewood.
So yeah, and it's family histories are wild. Like my great grandfather on my mother's side is half white, and he was raised for the first few years by the white family, by his white aunts, and then they, I guess, maybe got too dark. I don't know what happened, but they dropped him off with the black relatives. We don't know. Asked my grandmother; she only knew there was an aunt so and so, and that's all she knew, right? But she never knew the last. Well, we do know the last name. But anyways, my great grandfather apparently used to tell people he was descended from rich Jews because the last name was Rothschild. We don't know that, and I don't know if that's actually the name of the father. We know nothing, right? So it's there's so many mysteries. I remember talking with Professor Jacobs, and she told me about some sleuthing she and her family did, and they ended up lost. She told me once in a cornfield or somewhere. I forgot what state it was in. They were trying to find some ancestral lands, and they end up talking to the people who own the field or who work the land. And they're sitting there talking, and she's like, "Who's like Aunt Hattie Mae or whatever the relative's name was?" And the older person said, "Oh, well, that's my so and so." And come to find out they were relatives, right? So so many interesting ways we can piece together our stories. And so I encourage you to keep looking into it. And I don't know, maybe you'll stumble across somebody in a cornfield like Professor Jacobs did.
I absolutely love that story. And I feel so unfortunate for the students who could not have her, because at the end of her critical race theory class, she talks about how to trace her ancestors to find out. I think one of her first ancestors who were over here actually ended up purchasing their freedom. And she talks about that story and like uncovering that history. But coming back to you, 2 questions ago, you talked about being in Alabama. And so after law school, you started as a prosecutor and then you went into construction law and then you went to Alabama. Can you kind of tell me about the steps that you took throughout your legal career and how you ended up doing the work that you did in Alabama?
Sure. So when I graduated law school in 2009, the Great Recession was just hitting. For those who don't know, that's when the bottom fell out of the economy. They had been trying to sell so many people on the dream of home ownership that people were in homes they couldn't afford the mortgage payments on, and they had variable rates. It was just a mess. And I remember the people trying to sell houses real hard when I was graduating college, and they were like, "Buy a house, be a homeowner, generational wealth," and then people just got screwed. So, anyways, like it all came to a head in 2009, and law firms and the legal market was just, it was horrible. It tanked. I mean, large firms that promised people, you know, salaries, these beautiful six-figure salaries, they reneged on the offers or they delayed the start date. I remember one young woman, she was the wife of one of my colleagues. Her original firm, a big firm, she got a signing bonus or something. They gave her a little money to hold her off while the recession was going, and they delayed her start. Well, she needed to eat. She was married. She and her husband just both finished law school. They were trying to grow a family and buy a home. So she went and found a job elsewhere. The law firm came after her, the first law firm, and threatened to sue if she didn't pay back the start money they'd given her to survive. They'd only given her like I don't know, like $10,000 for the space of 6 months. But she had to pay it back. And I was like, y'all are ridiculous. So I went for a government job, and I ended up at the prosecutor's office. I wanted to learn how to litigate first, then I could become an IP litigator. Remember, I want to do intellectual property. So that's why I started at the prosecutor's office. My conundrum was that because everything fell apart, all the people who had been slated to go to big firms decided they wanted to go to government jobs. So everyone who would have gone to government jobs was now asked out. And so there were a lot of attorneys, especially from lower ranked law schools, who ended up taking jobs as paralegals or becoming teachers at private schools, right? They were underemployed because everyone was going down, they were kind of going down the rank of securing employment. So I had a job, but fun plot twist, the Florida bar for some reason was delaying my licensing. Sure, passed the bar. It was just all coming down to answering these ridiculous questions about where I lived for a summer or some crap. So I literally was trying to hold on to my job at the prosecutor's office. Mind you, we're making pennies. Back then, starting prosecutors made between $35,000 and $39,000, right? So I ain't making no money. And I couldn't get paid until I got licensed. So to keep my job, I would show up every day to work. I would go in the office and I would do research for the other prosecutors. And I would do for the motions to suppress or for senior prosecutors. I would work on appeals. I just do free labor. And at night, I would deliver food. I mean, now you got DoorDash and all these things, but that game was just getting started. So there was a local group called Doorstep Delivery in Orlando. And I would drive around Orlando delivering food from 6 p.m. to midnight and living off the tips. And that's what I did for 6 months until my licensure cleared. And then I was able to be hired full time. And then I still did my midnight job or my night job for about a month or two. Then I was tired. I quit that and I just prosecuted. So that's how I started. I wanted to get courtroom experience, and I wanted to do it in a way that people didn't expect me to do it, right? So a lot of people always expect Black graduates to go be public defenders. And I think public defenders are amazing attorneys. They're more creative than most attorneys who are practicing. They have to be. They are really defenders of the Constitution. But what I railed against was the expectation that that's where I had to go. And I understood that if I had ambitions for more than public defender, people, at least in the legal profession, hold it against you, right? And so I wanted to be a bit more nimble, no matter where my career may take me. So that's why I chose to be a prosecutor versus a public defender, even though my orientation is to defend and protect. But I enjoyed prosecution, learned a lot. And then, but in Florida, at the time, I don't know how it is now, but if you worked in prosecution or public defense or government work for more than 5 years, you were kind of blacklisted from firm life, right? It was always going to be a struggle to maybe make it into a big firm. You can maybe get into a big size firm or mid size, but spend too many years doing government work and people somehow thought you were intellectually incapable. And so at about the 4 year mark, I knew I had to bounce. It was time to go. I was hitting the sweet spot. And a thing I always did as a prosecutor is I always had other attorneys on my jury, even though my bosses told me not to. Because I was like, I don't have time to go to bar meetings or other functions. I need to advertise my prowess somehow. So I was like, bet, you're on my jury. And so after one of my first sex crimes cases, an appellate attorney was on there and he was the alternate. He came down, he said, great, amazing job. He's like, you're going to lose. She did a great job. And he's right, I lost. He said, but call me if you're ever looking for work. And so I ended up calling him and he put me through to some opportunities and I ended up doing construction law after that. Totally was not on my radar, didn't know it was a thing. For those listening, construction law is an amazing, amazing practice area. Like it's the wild, wild west of tort and contract law. It's just fun. And it's very hands-on, always in battles or conflict, and a very creative area of law. So I really encourage, especially minorities, to get into it and women and those actually who have multiple language skills, because there's a lot of Latin American contractors and or multinational organizations who have need of people to translate uh, contracts and documents. So construction law did that, loved it. But then my wife decided she wanted to become a dentist. She was looking for a career that would allow her to make money, but also still be home a lot. So she found dentistry, did it. And so we moved to Alabama so that she could pursue her dream of attending dental school. So she went to UAB. I moved to Alabama, took the bar, and I did medical malpractice defense for 9 months at a firm. Great people, learned a lot. learned that medical malpractice law in Alabama, you have to basically die if you want to win your case. Whereas in Florida, they are willing to wheel and deal and settle claims. But in Alabama, the appellate courts are so pro insurance and business that you have to force the case to go to trial. And even if you win, usually the civil court of appeals will reduce the award. So insurance companies are not incentivized to resolve cases. So everything was guaranteed trial experience. So in the end, when I got to Alabama, they loved all my years at the prosecutor's office because I had a lot of jury trial experience, and all those med mal cases were jury trials. So that leads me to what I was doing there. I was defending doctors and nurses who provided care at correctional facilities. So all of the people who died in those cases or were severely injured were usually arrestees, and they tend to be Black or poor. Uh, and that's when, what was that, 2014, 2015? There were a couple incidents where Black men were being shot, but also speaking out on some things. I think Christopher Dorner was a dude in California who is an ex, I think he was a veteran, naval veteran. He shot some people, and then he was killed, right? Because he had killed people. But then I remember my boss was trying to get into drone law. That was new. And she's trying to convince insurance companies to send us drone cases. And I would write blogs. And I remember a gentleman in Texas had been sniping people, a Black guy. And the police, they killed him and neutralized him, but they did it by sending an unmanned ground vehicle that was loaded with an explosive. So basically, it found him in the parking lot, in the parking deck, and they detonated, and that's how they killed him. And I remember being so upset and so just, I don't know what, I couldn't focus at work. And I was like, what am I doing? Who am I defending? And then I remember my boss asked me to write a blog on it. And I was like, are you serious? You want me to write a blog about drones based on police killing a Black man who was acting out on racial trauma that the community had experienced? So I understood why they had to neutralize the threat. But you want me to write a blog on this as a Black man? And I was like, shut it all the way down. Right. And so I went on a conference for Black professionals, met some people who did policy and other things with their law degree, and was like, you know what? There are other options. UF law did not do a good job of showing us options outside of firms. And so I had learned at that conference there are other options. As soon as I landed, that woman, my boss at the time, was blowing up my email. I told my wife, she's like, you know what? You look unhappy. I said, I am. Can I quit? She said, yes. Now, mind you, my wife is a second year dental student. We have no money. And she said, you can quit. And I quit. I tendered my resignation. I was unemployed for 9 months in Alabama. It was a tight legal market. And I ended up working for Legal Services Alabama, representing poor folks in non-criminal matters. And I literally made so little money, that I qualified for my own legal services. We used to joke about that at work. That's how I got in Alabama. That's how kind of I hopscotch. I do not have a linear career path. I zigzag. When I was at legal services, um, I found that the folks were a little, not sleepy, but they're just set in their ways. And so I was looking at laws that were being passed. I will give the Alabama bar this. They send out updates of laws being passed or negotiated. And so they sent out a spreadsheet of new bills that passed. And I went through them and I said, oh, these 8 look like they'll impact our people somehow, our clientele. So I sent them to my boss, who was a former US Congressman, Archer Davis. And Archer was like, Jonathan, I love it. I love it. I like the voting one. Make me a program. I was like, what, sir? He's like, yes, we will present it in Selma, Alabama in time for the anniversary. And you have 3 weeks. And so my mind was spinning like, I'm here to do landlord tenant stuff. I'm just trying to start filing lawsuits on some bad landlords. And so I had to put together a voting rights thing. So the law that was passed was a law to restore voting rights in limited ways for folks who had been convicted of felony crimes in Alabama. Because the Alabama Constitution, the Constitution 1901, the racist, white supremacists of that era embedded a provision that said if you've been convicted of a felony or a crime of moral turpitude, you lose the right to vote permanently. And as I suspected, and I've later learned from research, that provision was created to do any crime that they thought Black people might commit or poor white people. And that was a way to make sure that only the landed aristocracy could still vote. So, anyways, that survived, There was a lawsuit going on. Alabama was trying to get around the lawsuit by passing this law. However, when they passed the law, they did not detail how people could act, what the steps were, right? So they said, this is the law, and as long as you can clear this, you're fine. Just like, well, then how do I clear that? And the legislature and the agencies in charge were like, well, we ain't gonna tell you. So we created a program from scratch. I mean, I literally made that thing up. And we would do clinics, and I wanted people to be involved, right, with their own healing process. So I made a worksheet where we would find out information, put it down, and then I would tell them what the next steps were, and they could advocate for themselves, or if they got stymied or confused, they could come back to us at legal services and we'd help them out for free. And so we did that. And I did it for 6 months. We touched over 600, not 600, 300 Alabamians. I mean, there are some beautiful, sad, bittersweet, but impactful stories that arose from that advocacy. And that became a growing part of my job was doing the voting rights. Now, to understand legal services is it's not legal aid, but is a form of indigent work or public interest work that is funded by the federal government in part, right? They create the Legal Services Corporation. It gives out grants or programs in each state or offices in each state, and then they represent people in civil matters who can't otherwise afford an attorney. However, as I've learned over the years, legal services attorneys were way too successful in the 70s. And so conservatives uh, were railing against it, calling it socialism, blah, 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 blah. And so legal services used to be able to do class actions, voting, anti-prison work, anti-war work, all this. I mean, school desegregation. I mean, they were doing everything. Some of the most impactful U.S. Supreme Court cases come out of the era where legal services was brand new in the 70s. So they were like, oh, you people are doing too much. They neutered it. So now legal services can't do class actions. They can't do voting electoral work. They can't lobby. They can't do abortion work. They can't do school desegregation or integration work. There's a lot of little things they can't do. So when we started doing this voting rights stuff, it was touching in a gray zone, and people were scared of funding because in Alabama, legal services got all its funding from DC, unlike other states where there's enough people and economy where people can donate and give money, and their budgets are more varied. In Alabama, they were totally dependent on the congressional allotment. And so we were getting press. Soledad O'Brien wanted to interview us. Who was it? Was it Larry King had a new show on Netflix? He was going to interview us. Um, we were getting a lot of attention, right? Good and I guess bad. And so, anyways, it led people who are long timers at legal services to turn on Artur and the program. And so all of us he had hired, not all of us did the voting, but we were doing different things. We slowly left because it wasn't safe for us to remain. But it just so happened that I was doing that work. I had done a presentation. And when I did my presentations in the community, I was like, this is white supremacy. This is where it stems from. We're going to call it white supremacy. This is racist. This is some fucked up shit. Part of my French, I'm very earthy with my language. But I would say all these things, let people know I'm not here to sugarcoat, right? I may be educated, but I'm gonna keep it 100 with y'all. And so there were some attorneys and organizers from the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a big civil rights firm, like I call it a blue chip organization. They have a lot of money, a lot of resources, unlike legal services. And they saw what I was doing. And so the legal director reached out one Sunday when I was in the office doing work, and she said, would you be, what do you need to make your project grow? And I was like, oh, great, we need money because we're poor. So I was like, here is an idea. I put together a proposal. I said, boom, we could use money for this things and we could hire some fellows and blah, 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 blah. They're great. Here also, I went to look at these job openings at our organization. And I was like, whoa, not this time. My wife was pregnant with our first kid. I was making, I think, 40K. So I was back to making what I made as a prosecutor. We needed money. And so SPLC was offering more than twice, plus benefits that exceed what you can get as a federal government employee. I mean, the benefits are just amazing. So benefits and a great salary. And so I applied, got the job in the criminal justice division. And when I got to SPLC, the plan I had submitted to them that I wanted them to fund at legal services, they just had created it for themselves. They were like, we have the resources, we can create it. And so I helped out with that. So I was working on prison litigation, but also helping them set up their voting rights restoration. I would like to circle back to why project was important, because we created a process when the government refused to, and we started troubleshooting how the government was engaging with people and they sought it. we were creating forms. Like the forms I created as part of my clinics and stuff ended up being adopted in small ways by one of the government agencies. And then they tweaked and created their own, but they didn't have anything before I created something. And so me thinking that I was, a nobody attorney, started out as a prosecutor, never worked at big law, never did the shiny, beautiful, sexy things everyone thinks they're going to do when they go to law school, never made six figures. Here I am creating a process to represent and help people in Alabama. A lot of people in Alabama also can't read and write. There's a lot going on in Alabama. I'll just put it like that. But I'm creating a process
Well,
where they felt
like,
empowered, and then that forced the government to tweak their systems. And I ended up finding an ally within one of the agencies, a Black woman. And we would show up at the same outreach event sometimes. And literally, if I had an issue, I would go to her. And it happened that she was a supervisor within the division that did that work. And so she would get it done within like hours. I had an issue on somebody's paperwork. She would respond, boom, keep it moving. And we were able to grow something, a process. And so when I got to SPLC and helped them out, they had other people they had designated for the work, but I helped them create a database so we could see and track who we helped, what kinds of people we helped, what regions we were helping, were there trends. And in doing that work at SPLC, an organization with way more resources, we were able to do political work, unlike at legal services, so we could register people to vote. I could restore your vote and then tell you how to register. Before, I could only help you restore it. But then we discovered ways that some local government agencies were undermining registrations or restorations, how they were targeting homeless people, like in Mobile, Alabama, they were targeting housing displaced or housing unstable folk, or folks recently released from incarceration. In Huntsville, Alabama, we were finding that they were undermining the registrations of Black college students, because there's two HBCUs in Huntsville, Oakwood, I think it's Oakwood University, and then Alabama A&M. And so some folks had registered like 1,000 students, and all of a sudden those 1,000 people were not registered during a critical special election. So we were uncovering other things. And so it was just very exciting to see that in trying to help people feel empowered to reclaim their voting rights, we were uncovering and unearthing other forms of discrimination, right? Which led to other battles, but also led to victories. I had a white guy who was like, I could never vote. We restored his vote in Mobile, and he came back and told us how the person he voted for won by one vote. And he's like, I know that's me. I'm the reason that person won. And so there were people feeling impactful. We met a man in Tuscaloosa who had killed someone in self-defense. He was a naval veteran back in the 70s or 80s. And he had been told by people when he was in jail, waiting to see if charges would be filed, that he lost his right to vote because he killed someone. That wasn't quite the right interpretation of the law, but I understood why people said it back then. And so he never voted. He never got to vote for Obama. He never got to vote for Clinton or anyone else he felt was valuable. And so someone convinced him to come into the church where we were doing a clinic. And everyone said he's going to come with one deacon. And we were doing this in conjunction with the local public defender's office. And he's going to talk with one of the public defenders, and no one else is to talk to him. Come to find out, when we applied the law and his story came out, he never lost his voting rights. People had misinterpreted the law and told him that as if it was law. And so he came out crying, went and registered. This is somebody's grandpa, right? I had a guy who called me because someone gave him my number, and he was a long distance truck driver, and he was passing through Birmingham. He said, "Listen, you don't know me, but you're Jonathan, right? You're the guy who does voting. Can you help me get my voting rights back?" So he came out. I stayed after work late, like 6 o'clock. He came through, found out that he could restore his vote. He went back out. I met a grandfather who he just felt like if he couldn't vote, he wasn't a real man. And before he died, he wanted to be a real man to his grandchildren. And so we looked at his stuff, and I was like, "Sir, you can restore your vote." And so I gave him the steps. I said, "You can go finish this off. You don't need me." And he went and did it, and he came back crying. And we cried together. And he was just like, "I'm a man now. I can look in my grandbaby's eyes and tell her I can vote, and I'm a real citizen." And he tried to pay me. I was like, "Sir, this is work. I'm already paid for this work. So, go use that money to pay for it for someone else." But those are some of the stories, right? The victories, giving people back their dignity, letting them know that they are impacting their local community, uncovering other forms of discrimination, and coalescing with people to fight back. So, anyways, I think that's a long-winded answer to your question of what's my journey. It's zigzags, it's chaotic, it makes no sense if you're looking at it, but it's me following where I saw an opportunity or where my curiosity and passions lay at that moment. And that's how I follow my career. And that's how I follow it now. I now no longer follow what it is they tell me in law school or what looks pretty on paper or what somebody, needs to do to be a judge or whatever crap. It is what brings me joy, what brings me fulfillment, and what stimulates my mind, especially that last part. If it does not stimulate my mind, then that job is not for me. Right. And I can move on. And I don't care how much I lose or earn. Because another thing my parents did is they made sure we did not graduate with debt, right? They saved money and then I had scholarships. And so the way it all played out, I have no debt from my educational experiences, right? I actually was paid to go to college. I had excess scholarship money. So I have the financial freedom to choose what I do, when I do it, and how I do it. And so whenever I've quit a job or whatever, people are like, oh my God, aren't you broke? I said, I may be broke currently, temporarily, right? I may need more money, but I'm not desperate for it. And I'm not beholden to this opportunity or whatever you got going on. And so that's how I live my life professionally. I know it's a privilege not everyone has, right? But I really encourage those of y'all who may be beholden right now or feel shackled by a paycheck or a resource to become debt free, unshackle yourself financially. And when you do, you can do anything. It doesn't even matter. Just do what brings you joy. Do what improves the world as you see it's going to be improved. Do what makes it more safe for your descendants or your family members or your community. You know what I'm saying? Do what it is that you wrote in your personal statement when you said you were going to come to college or law school. And in my personal statement, I said I wanted to be a superhero. And I feel like I'm getting closer to that. So that is my path, my zigzag, my journey, my exploration, whatever you want to call it. And I am happier now with what I do and what I choose to do than I was in the beginning when I had to kind of take what would help me survive.
Really quick question. Do you have about 20 more minutes over our hour?
Oh, I knew I was going to do this. I sure do. Yeah, we got time.
Okay, well, one thing, breaking news for anyone who's listening to this because the law is always changing. A federal judge actually just declared the new map that Alabama drew is still unconstitutional. And so if anyone is interested in like doing a little bit of historical digging, this is related to not Moore versus Harper. What is it? Allen versus Milligan that came out of the Supreme Court in June of 2023. And so the Supreme Court sent it back down to Alabama. Alabama redrew maps that were still racially gerrymandered, and a federal judge just now deemed the new map still unconstitutional.
See how much money had to be spent and how much man hours that white supremacy takes from us? Those attorneys could be attacking other issues, but they're having to relitigate something that's already been successfully, which was hard as all get out in the first place to convince some white conservative judges that things were unconstitutional. They did it and had to do it twice. This is what white supremacy does. It wastes our resources and our talents on refighting battles when there are other battlefronts that need to be engaged. I am so proud of those attorneys. I am very happy the judiciary stuck to it because I know some of the attorneys fighting that battle in Alabama. Black woman it was the legal director at ACLU Alabama, and she was leading some of that litigation.
The same thing happened over the weekend in Florida. Yeah, on Saturday, the same thing happened. I'm from Jacksonville, and so a state court judge in Leon County, Florida, deemed the state of Florida's map racially gerrymandered Jacksonville. And so it's the same concept is happening all over, both the federal courts and in state courts. And so if there's someone who's listening who is maybe looking for a note topic, look at how much this costs. Because I know that there was a federal challenge to a Jacksonville map, and that cost the city over $100,000, and it was only a preliminary injunction that was lost.
It's just a waste, and that is how white supremacy operates. So yes, y'all, if y'all take nothing away, first off, the law is not holy. The law is just a meditation and the mediation of power, and who has it and who can create it. And the way this country was set up and the way it still operates, especially in the Deep South, white supremacy infiltrates the law. And so they'll just have you fighting battles that you know you already won. And it's draining, it burns you out. You have to protect yourself and your peace. Um, and because it's so difficult to move the boulder, I think this is important that folks should realize. One of the not benefits, one of the side effects of white supremacy is that from everyone else, especially those who are impacted by it negatively, it requires perfection. And I say it requires perfection because to overcome it, to topple it, you must be beyond reproach. Your theory must be immaculate. Your facts, your plaintiff, everything must be so that no conservative, no white person, no doubter, no outsider who doesn't understand the oppressed person's experience can say, well, what about? Shoulda, coulda, woulda, right? So you have to map out everything. And that has led a lot of civil rights organizations and practitioners to be perfectionists. And it has led, that means that a lot of civil rights organizations like to only hire attorneys who clerk or had a 4.0 or did all the shiny, beautiful things that you have to do to get into a big law, right? So a lot of, you wouldn't think it, but a lot of, especially impact litigators, high end, solid wage, solid compensation, civil rights orgs, basically you have to be a big law associate for them taking. In fact, they will take big law associates. Like at SPLC, we would get big law associates because they weren't getting trial or courtroom experience. So big law would send them to us for a year. They could get practical experience and then they go back to their firm sometimes. Um, that is a byproduct of white supremacy, right? But I want everyone to remember you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be immaculate. You don't have to attend someone's Harvard or Stanford or whatever highfalutin school. You can go to somebody's UF. You can go to somebody's FAMU law. You can go to somebody's Willacoochee State law. I don't care where. But if you have the curiosity and you have the wherewithal, you can push something and you should push and pursue. All right. I think we have forgotten that sometimes the most impactful litigation arose from people seeing a travesty and just saying, I'm not going to stand for this. Right. Maybe other people got involved later and then maybe they polished it up, but somebody had to bring it forward. Somebody close to the trenches, close to the ground. And so that is a frustration of mine with white supremacy. It expects and requires white perfection from everyone else to topple it or to hold it accountable or stymie it. Um, but you see why, because you have to be so detailed, so knowledgeable, so painstakingly skilled to get a victory and then to hold on to your victory. Because, white supremacy gets to bite at the apple a second time and be like, well, we hear you, but we just give no fucks. And so we're just going to do this racist thing again, anyways. Uh, Alabama is going Alabama. That is what I do remember about that state and why I was like, I'm not raising my children here. So I am so happy for those attorneys. I hope they get a break. They get to breathe. I know they won't, but I really hope they do um, because they are needed on those front lines. They are needed.
I have two last questions for you. And this kind of goes back to your answer when you were explaining how you ended up doing impact litigation. The second question is going to be for you to define impact litigation. But before we get there, you were talking about the stories of some of your clients, and you were talking about that you wanted your clients to be involved in their own healing process. And so my question is, why was it important for returning citizens? And for those who don't know, returning citizens are those who were previously incarcerated, but who have served their time in prison and are reentering society. And so why was it important for returning citizens to tell their own stories and to be able to advocate for themselves instead of lawyers being their voice for them?
Um, Probably because I didn't want them to always have to think they had to pay somebody or commit somebody to go pro bono for them. Alabama is a very poor state, and attorneys, if you're not one of the big four firms, you're most of the people go to personal injury because that just is your surest bet to get money. And so there aren't enough people willing to do pro bono or civil rights work. So I wanted people to feel in charge, right? I wanted them to feel like they could speak up. They spent so long being a number inside of a prison or a jail setting or being dehumanized, right? I wanted, as part of the process, to reclaim your voice. I want you to be able, because if you can reclaim your voice on this, then you are going to feel more empowered to reclaim your voice financially when you seek a job or housing or anything else in your life. So if this had to be your baby step to do it, I want you to do it. I also believe that returning citizens know the most about the system. They know who's trying to screw them over within probation or at the jail or the prison. They know who they need to navigate around or what the roadblocks are. And most attorneys don't. Like most attorneys I trained they were civil attorneys doing this pro bono. So they didn't even understand the criminal side of things or the criminalized systems. Um, and so I was like, these folks understand it. They have the living knowledge. And I also wanted them, if they could advocate for themselves, to then go talk to the people who wouldn't talk to me, right? We would hold events, and this is what I learned was bad sometimes. We would hold events at churches because what black churches are all like voting rights, let's do this. But churches can be very judgmental places for people. And so I was learning that folks didn't want to be at churches. So I started going to barbershops because I remembered sometimes barbers are returning citizens and sometimes they're cutting without a license. And I actually found some very interesting clients in a particular barbershop in Birmingham. I was very thankful for doing it there. But bus stops, homeless shelters, that was, I mean, boom, it helped a lot of people or got in touch with a lot of people at those. So I wanted folks to feel like they had some control. And then we were doing urban settings, but I had my family is from lower Alabama. As my mother used to tell people in college, she was from LA and they'd assume LA, California, but LA is short for Lower Alabama. It's where it's really rural and, people can't find places on the map. So we were from a small place in Monroe County. And I remember going down I'm the first attorney in my family on my mom's side. On my dad, we found a distant cousin, but on my mom's side, I'm the first. And I have 14 great aunts and uncles. That's a lot of cousins, right? And I knew they all needed help in some capacity. So I went down to do a clinic in Monroe County and nobody was showing up. But my auntie, she's not justice impacted, but she's involved in the community. She and another woman said, the way it operates here is people are shamed because they put your business in the newspaper, in the local newspaper. And so you're ashamed once you've been arrested. It's like they're never going to come out to your events at a school, at a church. She said, you're going to have to go to home, and you don't have time for that. Teach us, and we'll go home to home. And then once we help them, then they'll go home to home. So if you had to think of this like a virus, I know it's kind of off putting, but I wanted it to go viral. I wanted folks to become aware, change by their experience, and then go help others change. Right. And so then it would be a thing where you don't need an attorney. In Alabama, you don't really need an attorney to restore your voting rights. A layperson can do it. And so I wanted deacons, I wanted grandmas, I wanted aunties, uncles, whatever. I wanted them to be able to do the work themselves. So when I was doing even probation work, trying to help, no, parole, trying to help people get parole during the pandemic, those who are most at risk for dying in prison from COVID. Um, we would sometimes work with people. We would really push people to do the work who weren't attorneys, secretaries, paralegals. I helped a woman who reached out who her husband shared my family's last name. So I was like, I don't know if he's a relative, but maybe he is, but I'm gonna do this for the culture and for the family name. But she's a smart woman. So I was like, ma'am, you don't need me, but I'm gonna help you with what you've done. And it was through her efforts, not mine, that her husband was granted parole. And they had three autistic children, and he came home to those kids. So it is very important that lawyers not monopolize the way that change can happen. They show people who are most impacted, who understand the system the best, how to go after it. There's research out of Alabama from about 5 to 10 years ago that the people who go back after the voting rights the most traditionally were Black women, followed by Black men, and then followed by white men and white women, right? Those demographics of returning citizens fought for their stuff the most. And people were so desperate, they understood they had to pay fines and fees that they would do new crimes to get money to pay their court fines and fees so they could get their voting rights back. So we need to be able to show them there are other ways. You can ask the probation board to waive your fees and fines sometimes. We had to help them, show them the system so they could see that it only matters the fines and fees. And we had to push the government to agree to this. It's only the fines and fees that matter when you were sentenced, not when you were resentenced for a probation violation, not because in Alabama they add a 35% interest. The prosecutor's office can add 35% interest to any outstanding court debt after 3 years. So imagine if you owe $10,000 in fines and they slide you with that 25% interest, boom, it gets nasty. And then the money you pay has to go to that interest first before you can pay off the principal debt. And so we had to help people understand this is what you should be arguing, this is what you should look for, this is what you need from your paperwork, and this is what you push back on. And so that's what I wanted. That's why I want folks who are impacted to always be the ones advocating for themselves, with lawyers helping them, but not dominating or leading them.
So we've said the word impact a lot during this conversation. So for somebody who doesn't really understand what impact litigation is or movement lawyering is, how would you describe those concepts to somebody?
Yes. So All right. So let's start with the basics. There's direct services and there's impact litigation, impact services. Direct services is having, in the traditional sense, a client. You work on behalf of a client, you file a suit for a client, you defend a client. You're working directly on behalf of someone or an entity. Impact litigation is saying, I'm going to fight a battle in court on behalf of a class or a demographic or a type of people, but I can't represent everybody, all the humans. So I'm just going to find one or five humans who are members of that group, that impacted group, and I'm going to sue on behalf of those folks, and I'm suing a class action. So a class action is a lawsuit where you have some representative plaintiffs or people who've been hurt or harmed, right? And then using them, you say that all these other people who are similar, sufficiently similar, whether they're all Black living in a certain region, maybe they're all been harmed by a certain company, whatever, these people are sufficiently similar to bring forth the claims on behalf of everybody who is like them, who's been harmed like them. And so, we want to win this lawsuit. So that's impact litigation. It has been the the preferred method of the civil rights movement for the past, I'd say, 70 years. Because there's some benefits to it, right? You just find the best sob stories, the best plaintiffs, the most tricky factual cases where it's like, this doesn't really fit to the prejudice baked into this law. And you get those people to push back. That is why it's a great mechanism tool. And if you win, then you get almost immediate benefit in a sense for a whole swath of humanity or communities. But impact litigation means that you miss people, right? Or you're cherry picking. You're only looking for people that you think might turn the hearts of a white supremacist legal system. Okay, so you're going to choose, like we had some cases in Alabama where we would choose plaintiffs who maybe they weren't convicted of a nasty rape. Maybe if they were going to be convicted of sexual assault, it had to be they were teenage lovers, and it was only sexual assault because of their age or because one of the parents was mad. But it wasn't because someone forcefully assaulted another person, right? So you end up cherry picking the types of people that you think are acceptable for help, and there's flaws in that. Also, when you do impact litigation, sometimes it means that you're not understanding what it looks like through the system, right? So at SPLC, we were always litigating against the prisons and all this other stuff. But we did not, traditionally, they hired people who were from big law firms or clerks, or they did shiny things, went to shiny schools, but they had never worked in public defense. They had never worked as a legal services or legal aid attorney. And so there were a couple of us who came in at the same time who were from direct services background, and we looked at conflicts differently. We thought sometimes, yes, you can do a impact litigation, you can do a class action, or you can find one really good representative plaintiff and maybe fight through the criminal justice system, because I think the courts are more willing to recognize constitutional violations in a criminal context than sometimes they are in a non-criminal context. And so we would argue sometimes we should be representing individuals in maybe the court system versus doing big impact suit. Because you also have to understand an impact suit can take 2 to 5 years. That's 2 to 5 years where you're asking people to just be in the public eye, people who are already marginalized or in vulnerable positions economically or politically or socially, people whose benefits could be snatched or face retaliation from the government or the local power brokers, you know. And then half the time when you're doing impact litigation, because of some weirdness with laws and Supreme Court decisions, a lot of civil rights firms aren't asking for damages. Like they're asking for injunctions, which is just saying a rule from the court to tell the government or the entity to stop doing the behavior they're doing. But what about all the years of loss of income or childcare or medical bills or other things, right, that your plaintiff suffered? We weren't asking for damages. And I understood strategically why when I talked to enough people, but that I thought to me was a problem. And in a direct representation case, you're probably going to ask for damages. So that's the difference between impact, some of the differences between impact and direct services work. Movement lawyering is working with a group of people or impacted community to advance a goal. But unlike an impact litigation, traditional civil rights impact litigation, usually the attorneys or the big thinkers or the theorists, they're like, oh, this law should not apply in this situation. We must search America for a Black person living in this type of community, suffering this kind of harm from this kind of defendant. Right. So we would do that. We would literally go door to door, canvas like we were, trying to get out the vote or get you to vote for somebody or or talk about a candidate, we were literally asking, have you suffered this specific kind of harm? Please talk to us if you have. And if you have, now we need to vet you to see if you're a palatable plaintiff for the court system to see, depending on what courts we're having to go through and what judges. Um, that's a lot, and it's a little rude intellectually and emotionally, I think. Um, but movement lawyering is about working with the impacted communities, and regardless of whether they're palatable or not, doing what they need done to push for change or to reach a goal, right? So you, the lawyer, are skilled, you're knowledgeable, you do your research, you have access to resources, and you can counsel and advise and suggest and recommend, but you don't control the outcome. You don't control the battle. You do not control um, how that community is going to resolve their harms that they've suffered. And that is the difference in some ways between traditional impact litigation and movement lawyering. Now, movement lawyering can be direct representation, it can be involve impact litigation, it can involve lobbying, campaigning in different ways, it can involve a slick media or communication strategy. But movement lawyering is about decentering the lawyer and giving primacy to the impacted folk and helping them be the leaders, right? You teaching them what they need to do to lead, and you just being a skilled technician, literally, who is there to play, what you got to do in court. But otherwise, sit back, stay silent, and know your place. And so I think probably an earthy description of movement lawyering. I don't think movement lawyering is per se a new thing, but I think it's gotten new attention as a philosophy of practice. And you will find that your big organizations like maybe NAACP, LDF, SPLC, some of the civil rights, or not, some of the ACLU chapters, organizations you think of being here for 50 plus years, they have not, they're really into the impact model, right? And so some of them are coming around to the movement model. Some of them like, no, I'm good. We're going to keep doing how we do it. But you're finding new organizations like the Black Lives Matters chapters and the lawyers working with them, Dream Defenders in Florida, or other organizations that are springing up, new grassroots organizations. The Abolition Law Center, based I think out of Pennsylvania, they are all working with folks who are impacted and saying, what is it you need and how do you want to do this? Here are the options we can provide in our expertise, but how do you want to resolve this? And that's how they're going about it. There is a prisoners abolitionist or prisoners, I forgot the name of the group. It's based in Alabama, but they lead their own hunger strikes. They lead their own media advocacy. They have lawyers on the outside who help them, right? But they direct the lawyers what to do. And the leaders are still incarcerated or just being released and helping folks. So there's just different ways to do this work. I think movement lawyer is a great way for young attorneys, especially, or those who come from socioeconomic backgrounds that are not impacted by the harms they're trying to fight, to actually learn what it is to live with that harm and what is it people actually done and not just what you think you learned in law school has to be done.
Again, like I'm prefacing a lot of my responses with for people who might be interested in doing further research. But in the 2023 term, so the 2023 term for SCOTUS will start hearing oral arguments in October, and they'll issue opinions technically between October through June of 2024. However, usually all of the opinions come out between May and June of 2024. But one of the cases that the Supreme Court is going to hear in this 2023 term is about test cases with the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I do think that however that decision comes out will have major impacts on other kinds of civil rights litigation. And that's just for people if they want to do their own research. And maybe you might be listening after that case comes out. I don't know. But my last question for you is there anything that I did not ask you about that you would like to share?
I mean, there's so much we could talk about. Everyone's journey is different. Every first generation attorney, everyone who's trying to uplift their bloodlines or their families, everyone who's trying to bring into the room. And I would say this, I guess let me just give my general speaking points. Bring the people into the room with you who helped you be who you are or to get to this space. Bring the grandmother who had the mind of a scholar or a scientist, but cleaned bathrooms for rich people. Bring in the grandfather who gave up his scholarship to go to a college so that he could drive the bus in the country so his siblings could have a chance at maybe going to college. Bring in the room the cousin who maybe can't get right and keeps bumping up against the law, but has a mind that should have been in college or should have been doing really awesome things. Bring all those people in the room with you. Okay. Never be ashamed. Never wonder about why your name says it. Don't be worried about your hair. I mean, they're gonna bother you about it. But come in confidently and bring those people in the room with you, and you will never be alone. You will never be alone if you remember who it is got you to this point, who it is didn't get to be in this point with you, but could have benefited from it, or who could have thrived in it. Bring them in the room with you. Be courageous. Do not, this system of life in America, especially the educational systems, do so good at encouraging those of us who follow are rule followers or don't rock the boat. Okay. The only place Black people, and I speak from a Black perspective because that's what I know, I'm not going to presume for anyone else. We are only allowed to show aggression or assertiveness in sports. And even then, watch yourself, stay in the lane, and stay within this role when you show this aggression. Don't look to be an owner. Don't look to be the quarterback. Don't look to be the coach. Don't look to hold any part of the reins of power or decision making, right? And so I recognize that a lot of people I go to school with aren't necessarily built to be courageous or experienced at being courageous, right? Because we were people who just did what we need to do to get to the next step. You've got to shake off that conditioning. That is white supremacy conditioning, okay? I recognize why you did what you had to do, and I recognize that some of us are gentle spirits, but you are in a space that a lot of other people can't be. A lot of bright, talented Black people just like you, related to you, go to church with you, who for whatever reasons can't be in the room with you to do what you do. You need to be courageous. You need to practice speaking up. I know it's difficult. I am the most, don't let this interview fool you. I am a very tame kind of Black person, very chill. I don't necessarily like conflict, but I recognize that my mother, who had some aspirations to be an attorney, didn't become an attorney. And I don't fully understand why. She became a CPA, but that was her choice, right? But she really loved coming to see me do trials, right? And give me insights on maybe what I should do to argue. My mother still should be an attorney. I remember someone telling my dad he should be an attorney. He did not, right? But he ended up being an excellent, excellent school psychologist and administrator. And he has a very strategic mind. I think about my grandmother who was a domestic worker at a hospital. I think about my grandfather who was a long haul trucker. I think about some kinfolk I've met who are exceptionally bright and more talented than me and more than I will ever be in raw strength. They're not in the room. I'm in the room because I played the game the way the system wanted me to play the game. Be courageous. Start shedding that off. Find your voice, find your strength, find a way, even if it's baby steps, and it's okay to do baby steps, you know what I'm saying? To work on behalf of those that that's why you're here in this space to do. All right. Only 5% of attorneys are apparently Black in America. And it's not enough of us, right? It's not enough of us. So be bold, be brave, be courageous. Money will always flow to you somehow as an attorney. Don't worry, you will make money, right? But use that degree to fulfill the passions that sent you to law school or the things that are going to help those who look like you and couldn't walk physically in the room with you. All right. And do things that remind you of that. I love old school gospel music, but it also reminds me of the older folk in my family. So I'll play it at my desk. I'll play it in my office. I'll play it when I'm upset and I'll play it when I'm happy. And you don't have to know the songs and you don't have to think I'm the most religious or sanctimonious person, but I'm going to play that and I get strength from that. I have the funeral home programs of my grandparents and a favorite aunt, and they come with me and they sit in my office. They come with me to class in my binders because they should have been in those rooms with me. And I have to remind myself when I'm in those rooms, this is who I'm here for. And anytime I feel like I can't speak up or that maybe I'm not smart enough or maybe someone's more talented or just deserves the opportunity more than me, I have to remind myself, no, I'm here because of them and I'm bringing them with me and these Black people were very outspoken. I didn't even get to talk about my auntie. I'm going to talk about Ruby T. Rayford real quick. Ruby Rayford was a school teacher in Miami, Florida. She was Sigma Gamma Rho. That woman was feisty as hell. I love that woman. She was also very private, but Aunt Ruby was all about Black liberation and advancement. And so she taught to teach her students to be feisty. My dad used to regale us how Aunt Ruby was the only teacher in the hood the thugs were scared of. And they would mess with other teachers and mess with other teachers' cars, but they would protect Aunt Ruby's car. Aunt Ruby was so sick of the newspapers only talking about Black people in negative light that she made it a tradition every week she would write an article to local Black papers or the big white papers on positive news about Black people. She was just like, y'all ain't gonna paint us as pathological. And I learned after she died, and I was just like, I'm gonna Google her name. She initiated a lawsuit against, I think it was the Women's Club of Miami to integrate that women's social and country club. She lost the lawsuit, but it was a published opinion. And then someone did a subsequent lawsuit after her, and they were able to integrate the club. That was Aunt Ruby. She was never a lawyer. She was a feisty high school teacher who turned real estate agent in her later years, but she never stopped working in her community in Miami. She never left the hood. She never forgot her people. All right. And she would call me out when I was growing up if she thought I got a little too highfalutin or didn't appreciate the cultural context we hailed from. And I would always visit her whenever work took me to Miami until she passed. So be courageous and remember the people who couldn't do or have the privilege to do what you do, but who found a way to open their mouths anyways and push back. And that is what I encourage all of you to do, no matter what shiny law school you went to or didn't go to, no matter what your GPA was. I'm here to tell you my GPA sucked in law school, okay? But I passed all my bars the first time. How about that? Okay, you are not deficient in talent. You're not deficient in intellect. You are all that you need to be. God will make a way for your talents. You just need to go out there and apply them. All right. And do not let the system hold you back. I think that's all I want to say.
Thank you so much for sharing your story and for giving all of this insight. I'm pretty sure that not only myself, but anybody who listens to this conversation, if they're on the fence about going to law school or if they're on the fence about what they could actually do with a legal degree, I think that you kind of give that inspiration. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for this opportunity. It's been great.